At 76, George Foreman sits in a quiet space that no camera bothers to capture anymore. No gloves, no championship belts, no roaring crowds that once shook the biggest arenas in America, just an old man with broad shoulders that once carried both the fear of his opponents and the expectations of an era. He was once the embodiment of pure power, a name that made grown men step back, a destroying machine that rose from poverty to win the 1968 Olympic gold medal, then quickly became the world heavyweight champion after brutally knocking out Joe Frazier with punches so ruthless that history couldn't forget them. Foreman won fast, won cold, won as if he was born only to end other people's hopes, and for years, the world believed nothing could touch that man. But when the lights went out and the cheers faded, there was a quiet truth running parallel to the glory that few wanted to face directly. George Foreman had never truly escaped himself. He could knock out other men with a few punches, but he couldn't knock out the fear that had followed him from a childhood of poverty, nor could he defeat the simmering anger that had helped him survive, but was slowly eating away at him from the inside. Each victory brought fame, money, and respect, but it also left a deeper emptiness, where Foreman had to face the question no belt could answer. After winning everything, who was he? There were nights when the man who had terrified the world sat alone with that hollow feeling, with memories of the blows he'd thrown, and the parts of his life he'd left behind, realizing that his hardest battles had never taken place in the ring. They happened in silence, where physical strength was useless, and there was no opponent to blame or take down. At 76, with time having taken away his speed, his youth, and even his ability to hide, George Foreman carries a painful paradox, one of the strongest men in sports history. Yet it took him a lifetime to learn how to stand still in the face of his own fear and anger. And right in this moment, when all the titles have become the past, and there's nothing left to prove to the world, the most tragic question emerges clearer than ever. If winning couldn't save him, what did keep George Foreman alive? If you want to understand what shaped the man behind those legendary punches, subscribe to the channel to keep following George Foreman's journey full of pain and upheaval. The next part will take you back to his darkest years, where his strength was never enough to save himself. George Foreman wasn't born with anger, but anger found him very early, slipping into every corner of his childhood like a survival reflex. He grew up in Texas, and then Houston, in neighborhoods where poverty wasn't an abstract concept, but a living, noisy, persistent presence. A cramped house full of kids, where privacy was a luxury, and every day was a negotiation between having enough to eat and going without. The adults around him were tired, stressed, sometimes violent, and kids learned to survive by watching, imitating, then protecting themselves. For George Foreman, that world didn't teach him how to name his emotions. It only taught him that if you were weak you'd get swallowed whole, and so anger became the only language he knew how to speak. When other kids cried, George clenched his fists. When adults yelled, he stayed silent. When fear showed up, it didn't come out as tears, but turned into pressure building in his chest, waiting for an excuse to explode. At school, he wasn't the kid who stood out for being smart or well-behaved. He stood out for getting into fights easily, for his always wary eyes, for the way he walked like he was ready for conflict at any moment. No one asked him what he was sad or scared about, because in those neighborhoods, emotions were a luxury only for people who had time to think about them. George learned that to survive, you had to be tough, and if necessary, strike first. His teenage years passed in a string of days where the line between right and wrong grew blurrier. Petty theft, pointless brawls, running from consequences. It all happened in a familiar loop. George didn't think he was a bad person. He just felt like he was being pushed along, as if society had put him on a path and forgotten to show him any turns. Every time he was scolded, every suspicious look, every door slammed shut, his anger got reinforced a little more, became more justified, more necessary. It kept him from feeling small. It kept him from having to admit he was lost. There were moments, standing on the hot streets of Houston, when George Foreman was just a teenager who didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't dream, didn't plan a future, didn't believe his life could be different. That confusion was more dangerous than any fight, because it pulled him to the edge of disappearing, where a person could drift out of society without anyone noticing. For many starting from the same place, that path ended in prison, or worse, in short local news blurbs. George was very close to that ending too, so close that one more wrong step and there'd be no way back. Job Corps didn't appear as some beautiful promise. It was a quiet ultimatum. It wasn't an opportunity in the romantic sense, but the last door before the abyss. Step through, and you might survive, turn away, and you'd likely vanish. When George entered the program, he didn't bring hope or faith, he brought anger, distrust, and a body always ready to resist. There, for the first time in his life, he met people who weren't afraid of his anger, weren't intimidated by his menacing appearance, but demanded he take responsibility for himself. Discipline didn't come as moral lectures, but as unforgiving rules: follow them, or get kicked out. It was in that harsh environment that George Foreman began to touch a painful truth. Anger had helped him survive, but it couldn't take him further. He didn't know how to say he was scared, sad, or lost, but he knew how to punch. And for the first time that punch was put into a framework, guided, controlled. Boxing didn't redeem him right away, it just gave him another way to exist, a narrow path with clearer lines between destruction and discipline. Deep down, the boy who grew up in poverty and violence was still unhealed, but at least he hadn't fallen off the edge. Job Corps didn't turn George Foreman into a good person, nor did it erase his anger. It just held him long enough for life to hand him another direction. And in that lost, confused, directionless anger, a seed was quietly planted, the seed of a person who didn't yet know who he'd become, but at least hadn't disappeared from this world. Boxing didn't enter George Foreman's life as a healing cure. It came as a tool, cold and effective, giving shape to the anger inside him in a legal way. In those sweaty gyms, where sweat mixed with the smell of metal and human skin, George first understood that emotions didn't need to be named, they just needed to be released. Each punch wasn't technique or strategy, it was a release of pent-up resentment from a poor childhood, from days when no one listened, from feeling cornered with no way out. When the gloves hit the heavy bag, or an opponent's body, George wasn't thinking about winning, he was thinking about liberation. In that moment, anger became useful, encouraged, applauded, paid for, and that was more dangerous than any wrong path he'd taken before. George progressed frighteningly fast, not because he deeply understood boxing, but because he fought with something others didn't have: a reservoir of emotions that had never been fully drained. Coaches saw the power, saw the potential, but no one really saw the trembling, confused child inside who had never been taught how to stop. With every training session, every fight, George learned a dangerous lesson: the angrier he was, the more effective he became. Anger was no longer a burden, it became a weapon, and when a weapon starts bringing rewards, people rarely ask what the cost behind it is. In 1968, the Mexico City Olympics brought George Foreman into the international spotlight. America saw a young, huge, powerful man representing the nation's hope and strength. The flag waved, the gold medal gleamed, and the media quickly found the story they wanted: from poverty to glory, from the streets to the top. A new hero was born. But behind those photos and headlines was a quieter, far more complicated reality. George stood on the top podium, but inside he felt no completion, no peace, just an emptiness temporarily covered by applause. The Olympic win didn't teach George how to understand himself. It only taught him that his anger was acceptable to the world, if packaged nicely enough. And so the road ahead opened in the most dangerous direction possible. Success came faster than self-awareness. George entered professional boxing with a simple but wrong belief: if he was strong enough, scary enough, no one could hurt him anymore. Each win reinforced that belief. Each fallen opponent was proof that his anger was right, that his painful past finally had value. But boxing didn't ask George how he was feeling. It didn't require him to face his fears or learn self-control. It only required him to keep punching. And George did that with absolute devotion. He didn't learn to listen to his body or his limits. He learned to overpower everything with raw strength. To the audience, that was bravery. In reality, it was a legitimized form of escape. There were nights after fights, when the cheers had died down, that George Foreman still carried a nameless heaviness. Victory didn't bring peaceful sleep. It only quieted the anger for a moment before it rose stronger, demanding more. And since he had no other language to face the world, George kept answering every question with his fists. He didn't realize he was building a person based entirely on strength, with no protection for the day that strength was tested. The 1968 Olympics were praised as the moment a hero was born, but for George Foreman, it was also the moment a foundational mistake was stamped. The world called him a symbol, but no one asked if he was really okay, and he didn't ask himself either. The child who grew up in poverty and violence was still there, just now wearing the cloak of glory. Boxing didn't save George Foreman, it just gave his anger a bigger stage, a more justified reason to exist. And right here, in the early years of success, the seeds of disaster were planted. George Foreman's power grew faster than his ability to control it. Anger was fed without question. The unhealed child was given an adult's power. That was the most dangerous combination life could create. When power isn't paired with self-understanding, it doesn't just wait for a worthy opponent, it waits for the moment to turn back on its owner. The victory over Joe Frazier in 1973 wasn't like any crowning moment American sports had ever seen. When George Foreman stepped into the ring that night, he didn't bring the excitement of someone chasing glory or the smile of someone believing life was about to reward him. He brought anger sharpened over years, an energy so cold and heavy it didn't need crowd cheers to run on its own. And when the fight started, what happened wasn't a title bout. It was a release. Foreman didn't just beat Joe Frazier, he crushed him. 6 times Frazier hit the canvas, each rise tearing apart the arena's belief a little more. No clever exchanges, no prolonged drama, just a storm of punches raining down relentlessly, as if Foreman was trying to end not just the man in front of him, but everything that had ever made him feel weak in the past. When the referee stopped it, the heavyweight world championship belonged to George Foreman, but the atmosphere didn't feel like a celebration, it felt like a crime scene. Foreman didn't celebrate, he didn't jump on the ropes, didn't raise his arms to the lights, didn't look for anyone's eyes to share the moment. On his face there was no joy, just brief relief, like someone who'd temporarily lifted a weight off his chest. For Foreman, that win wasn't a destination, it was a pressure valve. Anger released strong enough to scare the world, but it didn't go away, it just settled, waiting for the next call. The belt around his waist was a symbol of absolute power, but it didn't give him security. It didn't teach him to sleep soundly, to trust, to be with another person without invisible defenses. Fame came fast and fierce. George Foreman became a name that made other fighters think twice before signing. He was described as a machine, a monster, an unstoppable force. But along with that fear came a growing distance between him and the world around him. Foreman trusted no one. He trusted his fists, his physical strength, his ability to dominate with legal violence. People became unreliable variables. Friends could betray, compliments could be traps, closeness meant risk. And so Foreman chose isolation as self-defense. He didn't need anyone, or at least he convinced himself he didn't. In hotel rooms after fights, when the noise had gone, Foreman was often alone, not because no one wanted to approach, but because he didn't know what to do with their presence. Small talk made him uncomfortable. Congratulations didn't reach the trembling part inside him. He was the champion, but also a man who'd never learned to let anyone into his inner world. The anger that had helped him survive now became a thick wall blocking any chance of being understood. Power gave Foreman a sense of control, but it was a harsh, isolating kind. In the ring, he decided others' breathing rhythm. In life he tried to maintain that feeling by keeping distance, by never showing weakness, by believing that if he was scary enough, no one could hurt him again. But the cruel truth was that power doesn't bring peace, it just hides insecurity better. Each win made Foreman more famous, but more distant from being human. He didn't learn to face fear, he only learned to push it back with violence. At the peak of his career, George Foreman had everything a boxer dreams of: titles, money, absolute respect. But inside, he was still the child from poverty and violence, only now his anger was cheered by the world. No one asked if he was happy, and he didn't know the answer. He only knew that every time he stepped into the ring, he temporarily didn't have to face the hard questions. Boxing kept giving him a clear role, the destroyer, and he played it with cold devotion. The win over Joe Frazier took George Foreman to the coldest peak of power. That's where he stood alone, looking down at the world with strength in his hands, but no anchor in his heart. That peak didn't bring serenity, just an illusion that if he kept winning, everything inside would sort itself out. But the higher you stand, the colder the wind. And in the silence after the cheers, Foreman didn't realize that the way he fought with hate was preparing for the most painful fall of his life. Uncontrolled power doesn't just scare others, it makes its owner increasingly alone. And at that peak, George Foreman was a champion, but also a man who had never touched peace. The night in Kinshasa wasn't like any George Foreman had experienced before, and he didn't know he was walking into the moment when every layer of disguise in his life would be stripped away without mercy. Muhammad Ali didn't stand before him as an ordinary opponent. Ali stood there as a living question, a man unafraid of Foreman's power, not avoiding it but staring straight at it with a calm that unsettled Foreman from the very first minutes. When the bell rang, Foreman charged as he always did, carrying the anger that had dominated heavyweight. But this time each punch seemed to land in empty air. Ali didn't counter with power, he countered with patience, with whispered words, with eyes that didn't back down. And in that strange silence, something began to crack in Foreman, the belief that his strength was absolute. Round 1 passed, then round 2, then round 3, and each round was a slow crumbling layer of belief. Foreman punched, Ali endured. Foreman increased the power, Ali still stood firm. There was no panic in Ali's eyes, just a cold waiting, as if he knew exactly the moment when Foreman's anger would betray him. The words Ali spoke echoed between the punches, not loud, not dramatic, but enough to pierce through the thick shell Foreman had built around himself. It wasn't provocation, it was exposure. Each sentence like a knife stabbing into Foreman's pride, reminding him that strength doesn't equal control, that anger isn't wisdom, and that not every battle can be won by hitting harder. The further it went, the more Foreman punched, not to win, but to hold on to the feeling of who he was. His body began to grow heavy, each step slower, each punch more exhausting. Sweat wasn't just from exertion, it was the sweat of confusion, of fear starting to emerge. This was the first time in his career that Foreman felt helplessness, not coming from his opponent, but from himself. Ali didn't need to knock Foreman out right away, he just needed to wait for Foreman to do it to himself. Each passing round was a wordless question echoing in Foreman's head. If my strength isn't enough, then who am I? Boxing had once given him a clear role, the destroyer, the man who made opponents fear him. But in Kinshasa that role no longer worked. Punches were no longer the answer. Anger was no longer the escape, and when the only tools he'd ever trusted began to betray him, Foreman had no plan B. He'd never learned how to fight without anger leading the way. He'd never learned to listen to his body, to listen to his fear. He only knew how to advance, and that night, advancing meant pushing himself deeper into deadlock. The moment Foreman collapsed didn't come like a thunderbolt, but like an inevitability. When Ali threw the finishing blow, it wasn't just a punch, it was the end point of a years-long illusion. Foreman fell to the canvas, and in that instant, he didn't just lose the championship belt, he lost the identity he'd clung to in order to survive. The man who had risen from poverty, from violence, from anger, now lay there, stripped bare before the world, with no mask of strength to shield him. The cheers rang out, but they didn't reach him. In that moment, Foreman heard nothing but the terrifying silence of a question he'd never been asked before. If I'm no longer the champion, who am I? Ali won, and the world kept moving, as it always does. Newspaper headlines shifted to a new name. New stories were told, new heroes were celebrated. But George Foreman stopped. He left Kinshasa not just with a defeat, but with a deep crack in his soul. The anger that had helped him reach the top no longer worked. It couldn't take him back to the moment before everything collapsed, and the cruelest part was that no one had taught him how to live after losing the thing that had defined his entire being. In the days that followed, Foreman carried the feeling of being stripped to the bone. He hadn't just lost to Ali, he'd been forced to see himself in a light he'd avoided for years, an unhealed person, a child, still trembling behind layers of muscle, a man who'd never learned how to exist without needing to inspire fear. Every memory of the fight came back like a cut, not allowing him to escape. What had once been strength now became a burden, because it reminded him that everything could be taken away in one night. When Foreman returned, there was no ceremony, no welcome, just the awkwardness of people who didn't know what to say to a champion who'd just lost his throne. He began to feel isolation on a different level, not the isolation of the man at the top, but the isolation of someone who'd fallen and didn't know how to get back up. Boxing had once given him answers to every problem. Now it only left questions. The rumble in the jungle wasn't just a fight, it was the moment George Foreman first confronted his own limits. Not physical limits, but the limits of a person who'd placed his entire identity and strength without building anything beneath it. When God said no that night, Foreman didn't understand it right away. He just felt the enormous emptiness, as if the foundation under his feet had vanished. The world kept turning, Ali kept becoming a legend, while Foreman stood amid the ruins, carrying a painful truth he wasn't ready to accept. Victory doesn't always go to the one who hits hardest, and when it doesn't, that person has to face themselves more nakedly than ever. After Kinshasa, George Foreman stepped out of the spotlight, not as an ordinary defeated fighter, but as someone who'd just lost his own compass. No familiar way back, no clear path forward. Before, his life had operated on a simple, brutal rule: win to exist, punch as the answer. But after Muhammad Ali, that rule shattered. Foreman kept fighting, kept stepping into the ring, kept winning subsequent fights, but each victory grew paler, not enough to fill the widening void inside. Winning no longer brought release, it only highlighted the question he didn't dare face: if I win and still feel empty, where am I going? Losing was something he couldn't bear. Every memory of Ali came back like an open wound, reminding him that the strength once believed absolute had betrayed him. Foreman began living in a dangerous limbo, not enough peace to stop, but not enough faith to move forward. He trained like a machine, not to improve himself, but to escape the feeling that he was falling apart. Each session was a desperate effort to find the old self again, the destroyer who once terrified the world. But the harder he tried, the more he realized that self wouldn't come back as simply as before. Those around him began to notice the change, though no one could name it. Foreman spoke less, became more withdrawn, his eyes no longer focused as before. He no longer fought with certainty, but with strain. The ring, once home, now became a strange space where he entered feeling both familiar and afraid. Each fight carried new pressure, not just to beat the opponent in front, but to prove that Kinshasa was just an accident, that his identity was still intact. But the more he tried to prove it, the deeper he sank into confusion. Jimmy Young appeared in 1977 as a challenge. Foreman believed he could overcome to reaffirm his position. On paper, it was a fight he was expected to win, but reality was crueler than any prediction. That fight wasn't like Foreman's previous battles. It dragged on, slow and tiring. Young didn't confront head-on, didn't give Foreman what he was used to. Each round passed, Foreman felt his body growing heavier, as if each punch drained energy. This was no longer a battle of power, but of mental endurance, and that's where Foreman began to collapse. When the fight ended, Foreman won on points, but it was a hollow victory. His body had been pushed to the limit, and his mind had gone beyond it long ago. In the dressing room, when the crowd noise had faded, George Foreman felt a wave of uncontrollable panic rise up. Breathing became rapid, heart pounded irregularly, vision blurred. He felt himself slipping from reality, as if his body no longer obeyed his will. In that moment, Foreman believed he was going to die, not symbolically, but real death, cold and non-negotiable. He collapsed, his heavy body drained of life force. In that panic, disjointed thoughts flooded in, images of poor childhood, street fighting years, the glory moment with Joe Frazier, the fall to Ali, all mixed into a chaotic stream. Foreman saw no lights, heard no cheers, only felt terrifying emptiness, as if everything that had defined him had been taken away at once. If this is death, he thought, then what have I lived for? That moment wasn't dramatic like in movies. It was pure existential fear, a naked confrontation with the possibility that everything he'd built could vanish in a breath. When Foreman gradually came to, his body was still there, but the sense of safety wasn't. He faced a truth he'd never accepted: he wasn't invincible, not just physically, but in his core self. The anger that had propelled him forward was no longer enough to keep him standing. It only made him more tired, more empty. After Jimmy Young, George Foreman was no longer the man who believed just stepping into the ring would make everything okay. He began to fear his own body, fear the moment it could betray him any time, fear silence, fear the feeling of no longer having a clear role in life. This wasn't fear of losing a fight, but fear of complete disorientation. No old way back, but no new path forward yet. In the following days, Foreman lived like someone lost in his own life. He didn't know who he was if not a fighter, didn't know what to do with the anger that had once sustained him, but now only left exhaustion, panic, emptiness, and existential fear intertwined, creating a state no punch could resolve. And for the first time since entering boxing, George Foreman faced an enemy he couldn't defeat with strength: his own disorientation. After the fight with Jimmy Young, George Foreman didn't leave the ring with a decisive announcement or a carefully considered decision. He left like someone pushed out of his own life, carrying the feeling that what had once kept him steady no longer worked. At 28, when most boxers are just starting to understand who they are, Foreman had reached the top and fallen into a nameless void. He retired not because he'd had enough, but because there was no way to continue. The ring had once been the only place that allowed him to exist without explanation. Now it became the place reminding him he didn't know how to live without fighting. The spiritual experience came to Foreman in no romantic way. It wasn't like stories retold with light and gentle enlightenment. It came as pent-up despair, like the cry of a man who'd tried every way to stay standing and failed. In the days after, Foreman lived with a feeling of abandonment, not by the world, but by the identity he'd trusted. With no more gloves, no training schedule, no fights ahead, he faced a naked question he'd never learned to answer: if I'm not fighting, who am I? Foreman turned to faith not for peace, but because he had nowhere else to go. It was a painful surrender, not a relieved one. He didn't find answers right away. Instead, there were long days of doubt, fear, and the feeling of standing in the wrong place in every room. He'd once been the center of attention. Now he felt small and out of place to the point of not knowing where to put his hands. Prayers didn't erase the anger. They only made him realize how deeply it had rooted. There were nights Foreman lay awake, not from physical pain, but from the lingering emptiness that wouldn't leave. No more cheers to cover the silence. No more opponents to blame for failure. Just a young man carrying an old title but no role to live with it. Faith, in this phase, didn't bring answers. It only opened more questions, forcing Foreman to look straight at the parts of his life he'd used fists to avoid. When Foreman decided to become a preacher, it wasn't a transition met with admiration. Many doubted, many smirked, many saw it as another impulse from a disoriented boxer. But for Foreman, it was the last effort to keep from falling further. He didn't enter the church with the confidence of someone saved. He entered with the trembling of someone with no place in the old world, and no footing yet in the new. Letting go of the fists didn't make Foreman gentle right away. The anger was still there, sometimes rising in the smallest moments. But unlike before, he had no place to release it, no heavy bag, no opponent, no ring to legitimize it. And in that absence, Foreman began to understand that not fighting could be harder than winning. Each day was a challenge, not of physical strength, but of patience and acceptance. Foreman learned to exist in a role he'd never prepared for: an ordinary person, with clear limits and unresolved questions. Faith didn't erase the past. It only required him to live with it, without running. No more quick victories to soothe the pain. Foreman had to face the slow consequences of a life built on anger. That was lingering fatigue, belated regret, the fear that he'd gone too far to turn back. In this period, George Foreman didn't find peace. He only found a temporary stop, enough to breathe, enough not to disappear. Letting go of the ring didn't bring liberation, but it stopped him from continuing to self-destruct. Facing God, faith, himself, Foreman understood this wasn't the end of the war, it was just a change of battlefield. Instead of other men, the enemy was now the parts inside him he'd avoided his whole life. At 28, George Foreman stopped fighting the outside world, but the hardest confrontation was just beginning. No round bells, no referee intervention, no clear victory moment. Just a man standing before the ruins of his old identity, trying to piece together a new person from fragments he'd never learned to handle. And in that painful surrender, Foreman didn't find peace, he only found a fragile reason to keep living, long enough to understand that the real war of his life had never been in the ring. The years after George Foreman left the ring didn't have the look of a spectacular rebirth. No illuminating light, no waiting audience, no beautiful story for the media to retell. They were quiet, heavy years when no one followed his every step. Foreman became a poor preacher in neighborhoods where hope was thin as smoke, preaching to people as lost as he once was. No stage, no flashy microphone, just small rooms, old plastic chairs, and tired eyes looking for something to hold on to. This wasn't a role that brought power. It was a role demanding presence, patience, and a kind of humility Foreman had never learned as champion. His family grew with more children, and with it came unavoidable responsibilities. The kids needed food, clothes, stability that old fame couldn't provide. Money dwindled, slowly but relentlessly. Small expenses once ignored now became constant worries. Foreman, who'd once earned money by stepping into the ring for minutes, now faced the reality that titles don't pay bills. No more fat contracts, no generous sponsorships, just sparsely attended sermons and prayers with no guaranteed results. For the first time in his life, George Foreman no longer controlled the world around him with strength or fear. He had to take responsibility. Responsibility wasn't commanding, it was showing up every day despite fatigue, not overpowering, but listening. Not winning, but not quitting when no one was watching. That wore him down in a way different from any fight he'd endured. In the ring he knew what to do. Here there were no instructions, no round bells, no clear ending. There were evenings when Foreman sat alone, counting every dollar, feeling clearly the nameless humiliation. No one wrote articles about these years. No one applauded when he got through a day without anger or giving up. He was no longer the man who terrified the world. He was just a father, a husband, a preacher trying to keep his small family and community from falling apart. The silence of these years was heavier than any booze that had ever rung out in the ring. Foreman learned that responsibility doesn't bring instant satisfaction. It grinds, slowly, repeatedly. Each day passed, like the one before, with no clear turning point to cling to. Sometimes he wondered if he'd been wrong to leave boxing, to abandon the only path that had ever given him value in others' eyes. But that question didn't lead to an answer. It only led to another morning, where he still had to get up and continue. In the years when no one was watching, George Foreman was forced to live with himself without the armor of fame. He couldn't hide behind fists, couldn't hide behind titles. Mistakes, shortcomings, anger not yet gone, all appeared clearer in the prolonged silence. And that very silence made every step heavier. No one praised his patience. No one condemned his fatigue. Everything happened out of the world's sight. Exhaustion didn't come from a single blow, but from the accumulation of hundreds of unrecognized days. Humiliation didn't come from public failure, but from having to accept that he was no longer the center of any story. George Foreman lived through these years, not with confidence, but with quiet endurance. Not because he could see the light at the end of the tunnel, but because he had nowhere else to turn back to. And in the years when no one was watching, when all the lights had long gone out, George Foreman began to learn a cruel but necessary lesson. A person's value doesn't only exist when there's an audience, but that lesson didn't bring peace. It only kept him standing long enough to move to the next chapter, where the challenge would no longer be poverty, but the question of whether a man who had lost everything would dare return to the place that had both destroyed and defined him. When George Foreman decided to return to the ring, it wasn't a bold declaration, not a dream of reclaiming glory, and certainly not a craving to be cheered by the world one more time. It was a heavy, quiet decision, made in rooms where bills piled up, where the innocent eyes of his children unintentionally asked a question he couldn't avoid. What about tomorrow? Foreman returned not for glory, but because his family needed him to survive. Not survive in the memories of fans, but survive with rent money, with food on the table, with the sense of security a father has to provide when all other options have run out. He returned when he was no longer young. The body that had once been an absolute weapon now carried the marks of time and years away from the ring, heavier weight, slower reflexes, and in the mirror, the man looking back no longer recognized the champion who had once knocked down Joe Frazier. The media didn't welcome him as a returning legend. They mocked him. They called it a farce, a desperate effort by an out-of-time former champion. Headlines with a sarcastic tone appeared, asking if Foreman was destroying the last bits of his remaining legacy. He heard it all, but had no right to argue back. He needed the money, and when you need money, pride becomes a luxury. Each time he stepped into the ring during this comeback phase, George Foreman didn't just face a younger, faster opponent, he also faced his own memories. Memories of Kinshasa, of the fall to Ali, of the helplessness when strength was no longer the answer. Each round was a negotiation between the present and the past. He couldn't fight like before, couldn't charge in with blind anger, his body wouldn't hold up. But if he didn't charge in, who was he in the ring? That contradiction made every fight a puzzle with no easy solution. Foreman learned to fight slower, more economically, like a man who knew each punch had to be paid for with breath and memory. He was underestimated, undervalued, and that hurt in a different way from public defeat. Being underestimated meant being erased from the big story. It meant that people who had once feared him now saw him only as an old name, a big but outdated body. There were wins no one noticed, no one praised. There were losses exaggerated, as proof he should stop. But stopping meant disappearing, and Foreman couldn't afford to disappear. Not when his family still needed every dollar he earned through sweat and humiliation. Age was an opponent that couldn't be provoked. It didn't react to anger, didn't flinch at old fame. Each training session was a negotiation with his body. How far could it go today? Lingering pains, mornings hard to get out of bed, joints reminding him that time wasn't on his side. But every time he wanted to quit, Foreman thought of the years when no one was watching, when he'd learned to take responsibility in silence. The ring was no longer a place to release anger. It was a place where he carried responsibility, round by round, fight by fight. There were moments, standing in his corner, hearing the sparse crowd, when Foreman realized the loneliness of this decision. No one forced him to return, but circumstances did. No one promised this effort would be rewarded, but he still had to step up. The comeback wasn't a journey of hope, it was a journey of duty. He didn't believe he'd become champion again. He only believed he had to keep going, because disappearing meant abandoning those who depended on him. Each small victory in this phase didn't bring great joy. It just bought more time, a few more months of security, a little more breathing room. And each defeat wasn't just a scratch on his career. It was a reminder that everything could end any time. Foreman walked a thin line between continuing and stopping, between preserving dignity and accepting mockery. No choice was entirely right, only necessary. Looking back, the George Foreman of these comeback years didn't resemble the man who had once dominated heavyweight. He was quieter, slower, and carried a painful humility. Not the humility of someone who had reached peace, but the humility of someone who understood life owed him nothing. He stepped into the ring knowing each fight could be his last, not because of the opponent, but because his body and memories could say no at any time. And yet he still stepped up, not for glory, not for history, but because not disappearing was an act of survival. George Foreman returned to the ring because he couldn't let himself become a closed story, not when his children still needed to see their father standing strong, even in dim lights, even amid the mockery of a world that had forgotten that sometimes, the greatest courage lies not in winning, but in continuing to show up when no one believes you should. In 1994, when George Foreman stepped into the ring against Michael Moorer, he was 45 years old, a number that in heavyweight boxing was almost a death sentence. His body was no longer the destroying machine of the 1970s. Each step was slower, Each movement carried memories of hundreds of training sessions, dozens of fights, and countless times his body had betrayed his will. But Foreman still stood there, not because he believed he deserved it, but because he'd come too far to turn back. The fight wasn't promoted as a fair contest. It was told as a bizarre fairy tale, an old man challenging the present, and most of the world waited to see him fall one more time. Michael Moorer was younger, faster, the legitimate champion of the new era. In the early rounds, the familiar script played out. Moorer controlled the fight, landed accurate shots, built up points. Foreman got hit, got pressured, got reminded that time wasn't on his side. On his face there was no panic, but no illusion either. He was used to being behind, used to the world believing he should lose. Each passing round was a quiet negotiation between endurance and the fragile hope that just one moment could change everything. That moment came in the 10th round, quick and ruthless like history had always treated Foreman. A right-hand punch, not flashy, not showy, just in the right spot and heavy enough. Michael Moorer collapsed to the canvas. The arena exploded. The referee counted, and when the final number sounded, George Foreman became the oldest heavyweight world champion in history. It was a moment any sports story would want to call complete redemption. A man returning from oblivion, defeating time, defeating mockery, to reclaim glory. But for Foreman, that victory didn't erase the past. He stood there, arms raised, the championship belt placed around his waist again. But his eyes didn't light up like someone just freed. It was the look of a man who had paid for too long to be allowed to keep living. The cheers rang out, but inside him, there was no explosion. Just a quiet feeling that finally he was acknowledged as still existing, not fully forgiven, not having the lost years forgotten, but recognized that he hadn't disappeared. The win over Moorer didn't erase Kinshasa. It didn't dim Ali. It didn't make the poor years, the wrong decisions, the anger that had hurt vanish automatically. Foreman understood that better than anyone. The new belt didn't make him young again. It didn't give back the years lost with family, didn't erase the times he had to bow his head for money, for mockery. It just put a quiet period on a question that had followed him for years, whether his life still had meaning. At 45, George Foreman was no longer seeking forgiveness from the world. He was only seeking the right to keep living without constantly apologizing for not being the role model others expected. This victory didn't turn him into someone else. It just allowed him to stand a little straighter, breathe a little deeper, and believe that the years of silent endurance weren't entirely meaningless. When the lights dimmed, Foreman left the ring with a bitter but honest realization: victory can change the present, but it can't rewrite the past. He wasn't fully forgiven, and maybe he didn't need to be. What mattered more was that he'd learned to forgive himself just enough to continue. Not to forget, but to not be choked by the past. At 45, George Foreman stood at a strange intersection between legend and human. He was no longer the angry boy from Houston, no longer the cold destroyer of the 1970s, nor entirely the peaceful man faith had promised. He was the sum of all those versions, carrying the championship belt as proof that sometimes life allows a person to return, not to perfectly fix mistakes, but to keep living with scars that have been acknowledged. That historic victory wasn't a happy ending. It was a rare pause, where George Foreman was allowed to stop, look around, and understand that he'd come too far, endured too much, to deny the value of his own existence. He stood there, not as a winner who had been freed, but as a man finally allowed to keep going, slowly, heavily, but more honestly with himself. After the victory over Michael Moorer, America began to see George Foreman with different eyes. No longer just an old fighter rising from the ashes, he gradually became a friendly, approachable, almost harmless figure. And then the George Foreman grill appeared, quietly but quickly spreading across American kitchens. Foreman's smile on the product box didn't carry anger, didn't carry violence, didn't carry memories of Kinshasa or the poor years. It was a smile America could trust, a warm, cheerful smile, as if this man had never scared anyone, as if his life had never gone through inescapable dark nights. The public loved that new image. They loved the way Foreman spoke slowly, humorously, loved the picture of an older man who had found peace, standing in a bright kitchen, talking about health and family. The grill sold not just for convenience, but because it was tied to a comforting story, a sports legend who had been redeemed, who had changed, who became a symbol of friendliness. America needed a story like that, and somehow George Foreman became the one to tell it without saying too much. But that smile didn't sell the pain. It covered, but didn't erase. Lucrative contracts, TV appearances, light laughter didn't make the past disappear. Foreman knew this very well. He never told his story in a way that made others uncomfortable. He didn't market his old anger. He didn't turn his lost years into emotional gimmicks. Some pains he kept to himself, because they weren't for display, let alone for sale. Behind that friendly image was a man who still carried memories of being misunderstood, feared, then mocked, and finally loved in a very different way. Public affection didn't make the old questions vanish. It just made them quieter. Foreman still knew who he had been, knew that the anger that helped him survive had also lost him direction, and he knew that being loved for a pleasant image didn't mean the past was fully forgiven or understood. The George Foreman grill gave him the financial stability that boxing had promised but failed to deliver. It kept his family safe, kept his later years free from worries about basics, but it didn't bring inner release. Every time he saw his own smile in ads, Foreman understood that it was part of him, but not the whole man. The real him was made from both ruthless punches and moments of collapse, from titles and quiet humiliation. The public loved the new George Foreman, and that was real. But that love didn't erase how long he'd paid to stand there. Pain doesn't disappear just because you're loved, it just changes shape, settles deeper, more discreetly. Foreman didn't talk about the nights he still remembered Kinshasa, still remembered disorientation, still remembered the moment in 1977 when he thought he was dying in the dressing room. Those memories didn't fit a friendly image on a kitchen shelf. And perhaps that's why George Foreman's smile had something very special. It wasn't the smile of someone who had never hurt. It was the smile of someone who had hurt enough to understand that not every pain needs to be exposed. America trusted that smile because it demanded nothing from them except comfort. And Foreman accepted that role, not because it was perfect, but because it allowed him to keep living without having to explain every scar. In this chapter of his life, George Foreman no longer fought to be loved. He didn't try to prove he'd changed completely. He just existed in a new image, gentle enough for the world to accept, strong enough for his family to lean on, and real enough that he didn't feel he was betraying his old self. The smile America trusted was real, but the pain he didn't sell was just as real. And between the two, George Foreman kept living, not as a legend with a wiped clean past, but as a man who had learned to carry the past without letting it swallow him again. When the lights of the ring of television and of America's kitchens gradually dimmed, George Foreman began to face a different kind of tally, one without exact numbers, without championship belts, without celebratory moments. It was the years of fatherhood that had passed without him being able to go back and count them fully. 12 children, a family so large that even at the same dinner table, there were still invisible gaps between people sharing the same blood. 5 sons all named George Edward Foreman, like a desperate effort to anchor his presence in their lives, as if naming could make up for the years he was absent. When he was young, when boxing swallowed his whole life, Foreman fathered in the way he did everything else, powerfully, imposingly, believing that physical presence, money or fame, could substitute for time. But time doesn't accept substitutes. The years he spent traveling the ring, in gyms, in desperate comebacks to earn money, the children grew up with memories he wasn't part of, evenings without a father, unanswered questions, moments he should have been there for, but was somewhere else, fighting the past, fighting fear, fighting the lurking disappearance. Foreman didn't lack children, he lacked the years of being a real father, and that was a truth that only became clear when he had lived most of his life. When strength was no longer something he could rely on, when fame no longer covered the silences at home, he began to realize there are losses that don't happen in the ring, and no referee counts down to end them. They drag on quietly, day after day, in the eyes of children, who had grown used to raising themselves. Regret didn't come to Foreman like a storm. It came slow, steady, and persistent. It appeared in fragmented conversations, when he realized he didn't fully understand what his children were thinking. In times he tried to make up with advice, but got polite silence in return. In moments he suddenly understood that love isn't just responsibility, it's continuous presence that he couldn't provide when young, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. The 5 sons, all named George Foreman, were a strange symbol of his life. On one hand, it was pride, a desire to pass on legacy, a craving to be remembered as an irreplaceable father. On the other, it also reflected a deep fear that he could be forgotten, that his absence would leave gaps that couldn't be filled. Naming is a simple act, staying is much harder, and George Foreman learned that lesson late. When time was no longer abundant, Foreman began to learn how to love in a different way. No more grand gestures, no more extravagant promises, just presence. Listening more than speaking, accepting that there were wounds he couldn't fully heal, there were years he couldn't get back. Love in this phase didn't carry the confidence of someone with a whole life ahead. It carried the fear of someone who knew each passing day was more precious than the one before. He tried to make amends not by denying the past, but by acknowledging it, acknowledging that he had been absent, acknowledging that his career and his fears had taken from him moments that couldn't be recreated, and acknowledging that love, even if it came late, still had value, though it would never be perfect. Foreman didn't demand complete forgiveness. He only hoped for the chance to stand still, not as a legend, but as a father relearning things he should have learned long ago. There was a quiet fear that came with that late love, fear that he'd arrived too late, fear that the distances had become habits, fear that his children had learned to live without needing him. But Foreman stayed there, even trembling, even clumsily, because he understood that not being there would be the real failure. If life had taught him anything after all the championship belts and the falls, it was the lesson that love isn't something you declare, it's something you persistently practice, even when time is no longer on your side. In this chapter of his life, George Foreman no longer counted victories. He counted conversations, counted the times he showed up, counted the small moments he had once taken for granted. Each of those moments carried a bit of regret, a bit of atonement, and a lot of love mixed with the fear of being late. And perhaps that was the hardest fight he'd ever stepped into, a fight with no audience, no bell, but one that decided how he would be remembered not as a champion, but as a man who tried to love when he finally understood the value of time. When old age arrived, it didn't knock loudly like the championship nights of the past. It entered quietly, bringing a body that remembered everything the mind sometimes tried to forget. George Foreman woke up each morning, not to the sound of a round bell, but to lingering aches like faithful reminders that time didn't miss a single blow, shoulders heavy as stone, back stiff as cooled steel, knees protesting every first step of the day. His body didn't need history to remember, it was history. The punches he'd thrown, the blows he'd taken, the years of training to exhaustion, all settled into his bones and flesh. No big scars to boast about, just accumulated weariness, repeating, steady to the point of becoming the background of life. There were mornings when Foreman sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, waiting for his body to agree to let him stand, not out of weakness, but because every movement now was a negotiation. In his youth, he forced his body to obey. Old age forced him to learn to listen. The silence in these years was heavier than any cheers he'd ever heard. No more 20,000 people roaring. No more lights heating the air. Just a quiet room, steady breathing, and the feeling that the world had moved to a different rhythm. When young Foreman fought to be noticed, now he learned to exist without needing it. But that shift wasn't easy. Cheers had once covered the pain. Silence exposed it. There were moments when Foreman remembered the feeling of standing in the center of the ring, with every eye on him, when his body, even in pain, was full of adrenaline and purpose. Now purpose no longer came from outside. It had to be found in small things, slow walks, maintaining health, being present with family, accepting limits. That was a different kind of discipline, no less harsh than pushing through 12-round fights. The body remembered everything, even the moments the mind had once dismissed. It remembered the days he overtrained out of fear of losing, the nights he didn't sleep because of insecurity, the years he used strength to hide fear. Now those memories were no longer clear images, but they were present in every lingering ache, every slow step. Foreman didn't resent his body. He saw it as an old friend that had accompanied him through too many battles to blame. Old age didn't bring weakness. It brought honesty. No more places to hide. No more shell of strength to lean on. Just a person forced to accept that everything that had happened left marks. Foreman learned to live with those marks, without embellishing, without complaining. He understood that each ache was part of the price paid for a turbulent life. There were good days when the body cooperated, when he could laugh, talk, even forget the fatigue for a moment. And there were bad days, when every movement reminded him he was no longer young. But in both, Foreman carried a rare acceptance. Not surrender, but acknowledgement. He'd lived long enough to know resisting time was futile. The only thing to do was go along with it, slowly, honestly. The silence of old age wasn't like the silence of defeat. It was like a space where old noise was no longer needed. Foreman didn't need to be remembered every day. He didn't need to retell his feats. His body did that for him. In every ache, every hard morning standing up. And perhaps, in that heavy silence, George Foreman found a kind of peace very different from what he'd known before. Not dazzling, no applause, but real. A peace built not from victories, but from living long enough to accept the full price of his life. At 76, George Foreman no longer counted victories. The numbers that once made the world respect him now lay quiet in books, no longer holding power over him like before. When time had taken away speed, strength, and even the need to prove himself, the remaining questions no longer pointed outward, they turned straight inward. He didn't ask himself how many fights he'd won, how much money he'd made, or how long he'd stood at the top. Those questions were too easy, too clean, too much like what the world had once asked for him. The questions at 76 were different. They were heavier, slower, and without clear answers. How many people have I hurt? That question didn't ring out like a dramatic accusation, but like a long sigh stretching over years. George Foreman remembered the faces in the ring, the men who fell under his hands, not just because they lost, but because he poured his anger onto them. When young, he called it the job. He called it competition. He called it necessary for survival. But at this age, with the anger settled, the question could no longer be avoided. How many punches were thrown not just to win but to hurt? How many moments he chose power over control, not to condemn himself, but to understand how he'd lived his life? How many moments have I missed? That question came with very small, very ordinary images. Family evenings he wasn't there for, birthdays that passed while he was in the gym or on the road for a comeback, times his children needed a father, but only his fame showed up instead. Foreman didn't blame anyone else. He knew those choices were his, even if driven by fear, by financial responsibility, by the feeling that if he stopped, he'd disappear. But understanding the reasons didn't make the regret lighter. It only made it more real. These questions had no complete answers. Foreman didn't try to answer them with late excuses. He didn't say he had no other choice. He didn't say everything happened because it was fate. At 76, he understood that life doesn't run on neat answers. It runs on accepting that some things can't be fixed. They can only be carried. The questions didn't leave not to torment him, but to remind him that he'd lived a real life with real consequences. There were quiet nights, when body aches wouldn't allow deep sleep, when those questions returned clearer, not loud, not pressing, just present. Foreman no longer tried to chase them away. He let them stay as part of himself. Not to punish himself, but to not forget that every victory had come with a price, and every choice had left an emptiness somewhere. He also wondered if he'd said enough apologies, if his late presence was enough to make up for the absent years, if becoming gentle in the public's eyes truly reflected inner change, or was just a new skin he'd learned to wear. But even those questions, Foreman didn't force to a conclusion. At this age, he understood that life doesn't require us to close every chapter perfectly. It only requires us to look straight at the ones already written. George Foreman no longer sought forgiveness from the world. He knew the world had moved on long ago. New generations didn't grow up fearing his name. They knew him through the grill, through the smile, through stories retold more gently, and that didn't make him angry. It only made him realize that a person's memory doesn't lie entirely in how others remember them, but in how they live with the questions that remain. At 76, Foreman lived with unanswered questions like he lived with the pains in his body. They didn't disappear, but they no longer controlled him. They reminded him to slow down, listen, and when needed, be silent. Not every question needs an answer. Some just need acknowledgement. And in that acknowledgement, George Foreman found a kind of honesty it had taken him a long time to achieve. Those questions wouldn't leave until the end. And perhaps that's what gave them meaning. They kept him connected to his humanity, not hiding behind titles, not hiding behind the public smile, not hiding behind beautiful stories. At 76, George Foreman no longer tried to conclude his life. He just kept living, day by day, with the questions that wouldn't go away, as proof that he had truly been present in his own life, with all its incompleteness. George Foreman didn't enter 76 as a fully redeemed man. He didn't find an ending point where every pain was resolved, every mistake erased, every question had a soothing answer. The peace that came to him was late, slow, and incomplete, but it came honestly. Not the peace of a saint, but of a man tired from running from himself for half a lifetime and finally accepting to stop. Foreman didn't become a perfect moral example. He didn't deny the anger that had shaped him. He didn't pretend that the ruthless punches, the absent years, the hurts he caused were just necessary lessons. At this age, he understood that some things can't be named more gently. Some mistakes don't need justification, they just need acknowledgement. And that acknowledgement didn't bring glory. It only brought truth. George Foreman didn't defeat death. His body reminded him every day that time was moving forward without negotiation. The aches didn't lessen because he'd learned lessons. Old age didn't soften just because he'd lived better. But there was one thing he had defeated, late but decisively: denial. He no longer pretended he was okay when he wasn't. He no longer used strength, fame, or the public smile to cover the inner voids. He called things by their right names and allowed them to exist without distortion. The reconciliation Foreman achieved wasn't with the world. The world had moved on long ago. It was reconciliation with himself, with the boy who grew up in poverty and anger, with the young man who believed that if he was strong enough he'd never be hurt, with the champion who thought silence meant victory. At 76, he looked straight at each of those versions and didn't discard any. He didn't choose to forget. He chose to carry them. There was a quiet sadness in that late peace, because Foreman knew very well that if he'd understood these things sooner, maybe many things would have been different. Maybe he'd have hurt others less. Maybe he'd have stayed longer in moments he shouldn't have missed. But life doesn't allow do-overs. It only allows looking back, and looking back, without running away, was already a rare act of courage. Foreman didn't stand at the end of life with a feeling of victory. He stood there with a feeling of acceptance that he'd lived an intense life, unbalanced, with more mistakes than outsiders saw, acceptance that his love sometimes came late, that his gentleness took a long time to learn, and acceptance that not everyone needs to be fully healed to keep living. Some just need to stop running away. The final days weren't told through big events. They were told through a slow rhythm, through aching but clear mornings, through conversations that no longer had to prove anything. Foreman no longer tried to be the best version in others' eyes. He just tried to be the most honest version of himself. No promises, no embellishing, no hiding. Perhaps the most heartbreaking thing in George Foreman's story isn't the public falls, but the truth that it took him a lifetime to understand he didn't need to be invincible to deserve to exist. And when he understood that, time was no longer generous, but he still chose to understand. And that choice, even late, still held meaning. Foreman left the ring long ago, but his biggest fight only truly ended when he stopped denying the less beautiful parts of his life. He wasn't fully redeemed. He didn't become a perfect symbol of change, He just became a man brave enough to look straight at his life without turning away. And in a world that prefers to celebrate victory over honesty, that was a quiet but profound win. Some people aren't healed, but they learn to live without running away anymore. George Foreman was one of those people, not because he was weak, but because he was brave enough to stop. And in that stopping, he didn't find complete redemption, but something perhaps rarer, the final truth of himself. The story of George Foreman makes people sad not because he lost to someone in the ring, but because he had to fight himself for so long before daring to stop. Behind the 1968 Olympic gold medal, the brutal knockout of Joe Frazier in 1973, and the historic victory at 45 against Michael Moorer in 1994, there was always a Houston child who grew up in poverty, violence, and without language to name emotions, only anger. In the story, boxing didn't heal him, it legitimized that anger, turning each punch into a release of resentment, until Muhammad Ali in the Rumble in the Jungle stripped away the cruel truth: strength can't save an uncontrolled soul. The most painful part was Foreman's exhaustion after Jimmy Young, panicking to the point of thinking he was dying, the moment showing that behind the strongest man image was an empty, existentially terrified human. Then the years as a poor preacher, money running out, large family, learning responsibility instead of control, returning to the ring not for glory, but because he couldn't let his family disappear with him. America may love the George Foreman grill smile, but the pain he didn't sell. The lesson for Americans is success doesn't automatically heal. If we don't dare name anger, fear, loneliness, we'll pay with missed years with family and ourselves. Foreman didn't beat death, he beat denial, and that was the hardest, most human victory. If the story of George Foreman makes you pause to think about strength, pain, and honesty with yourself, subscribe to the channel to continue joining us in other haunting and human life journeys. Thank you for listening to the end, and see you in the next video, where we'll continue telling stories not just about victories, but about the real price of being human.